What if you went to work one morning and never came home? What if your family searched for you for years and the ocean gave back nothing? And then, nearly a decade later, someone found proof that you had survived, but raised even darker questions about what happened next. This is not fiction. This happened. And to this day, no one has the full answer. The town that time forgot. There is a place on the island of Maui that most people will never visit, not because it isn't beautiful, but because getting there is half the battle. To reach Hana, you follow a single winding road that curls around the northeastern coastline of the island for over 50 miles. Sharp bends, narrow lanes, rainforest on one side, dramatic ocean cliffs on the other. Rental car companies once flat out banned their vehicles from being driven on it. That should tell you everything. Hana itself is tiny. A few hundred people. Old plantation-era homes. One gas pump in town. The nearest shopping center, over 50 miles away. No local TV. Limited radio. The outside world felt genuinely far away here. And for most residents, that was exactly the point. The community was close. Everyone knew everyone. And the ocean, as stunning as it was treated with deep respect. The waters surrounding Hana sit above a channel that drops to 6,000 feet, with depths beyond it reaching 20,000 feet. The wind crosses thousands of miles of open Pacific before hitting these shores, and it brings everything with it. Giant swells, violent currents, unpredictable weather that can shift within minutes. No commercial fishing fleet operated out of Hana. It was simply too dangerous. But on mornings when the ocean went quiet, when the channel calmed and the bay looked like polished glass, the unspoken rule in Hana was simple. Work can wait. February 11th, 1979. It was a Sunday. The kind of morning that makes you forget every difficult day you've ever had. A young man named Ralph stepped outside and immediately noticed that Hana Bay was unusually still. No whitecaps. No heavy wind. Just calm, inviting water. He made a decision on the spot, abandoned his plans for the day, drove to his twin brother Robert's house, and borrowed the family boat. It wasn't a grand vessel. A 17-foot fiberglass hull, bright blue, with a backup engine and a basic CB radio on board. Small and modest, but the manufacturer had made a bold claim in their TV ads at the time. They called it unsinkable. Robert had named it the Sarah Joe, combining his parents' first names. Ralph then gathered 4 friends, Pat, Peter, Benny, and Scott. 5 men in their 20s and 30s. Long hair, casual attitude, the kind of guys who jumped at any excuse to get out on the water. They stopped at the general store, loaded up on drinks, ice, and a few spark plugs. Then they launched the Sarah Joe from Hana Bay just before 10 in the morning. The plan was straightforward. Head out to Ralph's favorite fishing spot, catch some large fish, sell some to the store, share the rest with family. A perfect Sunday. By noon, the sky had a completely different opinion. The search and its aftermath. What followed became the largest maritime search in Hawaiian history. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard deployed 44 aircraft and covered more than 70,000 square miles of open ocean, logging 330 hours of flight time in the process. On day 5, they stopped. For the families of Hana, that decision was devastating and infuriating. They believed the search had been flawed from the beginning. The strong northerly winds on the day of the disappearance should have pushed the Sarah Joe in a predictable direction, they argued. The search had focused on the wrong areas. The Coast Guard had been reactive instead of strategic. There were also reports from 2 separate individuals that a distress call had been picked up on the radio. A voice identifying the vessel as the Sarah Joe, saying the engine had failed. The Coast Guard reviewed the claims and dismissed both of them. Within a week of the men going missing, they were officially declared dead. Hana refused to accept that verdict. The community pulled together $50,000, hiring boats and private aircraft to continue the search independently. People walked miles of shoreline daily. Those with nothing else to give showed up anyway and kept looking. After a month, the money was gone. The only thing recovered was a single life jacket on a beach, one that didn't belong to the Sarah Joe. A year later, the town held a memorial service, not because they had given up hope, but because they needed to grieve. They needed to breathe. And then, silence. Years of it. No sightings. No wreckage. No answers. The ocean had swallowed 5 men whole and offered nothing back. The storm that came from nowhere. Weather in Hana didn't always arrive with warning. The radio coverage barely reached them. There were no local television stations broadcasting forecasts, and the small craft advisories issued for the surrounding channel were so frequent that locals had long stopped treating them as serious alerts. What rolled in that afternoon was something else entirely. The wind reversed direction and doubled in speed within minutes. By early afternoon, it was classified as gale force, sustained winds exceeding 35 miles per hour, driving sheets of rain so heavy that over an inch fell in a single hour. The channel, which had looked inviting at sunrise, transformed into something fishermen described as a wall of moving water. 3 larger boats that had gone out that morning managed to fight their way back to Hannah Bay. Their crews came ashore shaken. One captain said he had fished these waters his entire life and had never seen anything like what he witnessed that afternoon. He described the channel as behaving like a fast-moving river, except vertical. The families had already gathered at the bay. They stood watching the horizon, willing the Sarah Joe to appear around the headland. It never did. By evening, with no sign of the 5 men, the local police were contacted. The US Coast Guard dispatched aircraft. Local fishermen, including Peter's own father, went back out into those waters to search. When Peter's father returned, he could barely describe what he had encountered. Swells reaching 40 feet. Seas so violent that a boat could have been just 50 yards away and remained completely invisible. The Sarah Joe was a blue boat on a dark churning ocean. Finding it was almost an impossible task. The search and its aftermath. What followed became the largest maritime search in Hawaiian history. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard deployed 44 aircraft and covered more than 70,000 square miles of open ocean, logging 330 hours of flight time in the process. On day 5, they stopped. For the families of Hannah, that decision was devastating and infuriating. They believed the search had been flawed from the beginning. The strong northerly winds on the day of the disappearance should have pushed the Sarah Joe in a predictable direction, they argued. The search had focused on the wrong areas. The Coast Guard had been reactive instead of strategic. There were also reports from 2 separate individuals that a distress call had been picked up on the radio. A voice identifying the vessel as the Sarah Joe, saying the engine had failed. The Coast Guard reviewed the claims and dismissed both of them. Within a week of the men going missing, they were officially declared dead. Hannah refused to accept that verdict. The community pulled together. $50,000. Hiring boats and private aircraft to continue the search independently. People walked miles of shoreline daily. Those with nothing else to give showed up anyway and kept looking. After a month, the money was gone. The only thing recovered was a single life jacket on a beach, one that didn't belong to the Sarah Joe. A year later, the town held a memorial service, not because they had given up hope, but because they needed to grieve. They needed to breathe. And then, silence. Years of it. No sightings. No wreckage. No answers. The ocean had swallowed 5 men whole and offered nothing back. The island at the edge of the world, 2,300 miles southwest of Hawaii. There is a place that most people will never know exists. Sabila Island is part of an atoll in the Marshall Islands, a ring of tiny landmasses sitting barely above the surface of the Pacific. Sabila itself stretches about 3 miles from end to end. At its widest point, it measures just 1,000 feet across. Its highest elevation is only a few feet above sea level. There is almost nothing there. A thin fringe of vegetation running through the middle. Sandy beaches on either side. Occasional sea turtles. A few seabirds passing through on longer journeys. No fresh water. No edible plants to speak of. The surrounding reef supports very little fish life. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most inhospitable and isolated places on the planet. In September of 1988, nearly a decade after the Sarah Joe vanished, a small team of researchers arrived on Sabila Island. They had been commissioned by the Marshallese government to assess various islands as potential wildlife sanctuary locations. Sabila was on their list, though not considered a strong candidate. They had barely begun their survey when one of the scientists noticed something partially buried in the sand, about 50 yards from the shoreline, on the lagoon side of the island. It was the hull of a boat. What the sand had been keeping The researcher knelt beside the fiberglass hull and searched for a registration number. It was heavily faded, but the first two letters were visible. Hawaii registration. He moved to the other side of the hull looking for a name. The paint had mostly surrendered to years of exposure, but four letters were still legible. SAHJ. The researcher's name was John Norton. He was a marine biologist, and 9 years earlier, he had joined the community search for a fishing boat that disappeared off the coast of Maui during a storm. He knew immediately what he was looking at. He looked inside the hull. Human bones dot the grave. John organized a thorough search of the island. Not far from the hull, he found something that stopped him completely. A cross, constructed from pieces of driftwood, had been planted in the sand. Around its base, flat pieces of coral had been carefully arranged into a low mound. Wedged between the coral stones was a small bundle of paper, roughly 3 inches square and 3/4 of an inch thick, with thin sheets of what appeared to be aluminium, foil pressed between the pages. The edges of the bundle showed signs of scorching, as though someone had attempted to set it alight. And resting at the top of the coral mound, a human jawbone, dental fillings still visible in the teeth. John studied the bones carefully. Something about them didn't align with the timeline. 9 years of sun, salt air, and exposure should have bleached the bones completely. These bones hadn't been there that long. His estimate, based on their condition, was 4 to 5 years, perhaps less, which meant that if this was the Sarajevo, someone, or something, had returned to this island years after the boat first arrived, and someone had dug a grave. The identity. The Coast Guard reopened the case. Forensic specialists from an army identification laboratory were brought to Sabila Island. They carefully excavated the grave, catalogued every fragment, and returned to their lab. The manufacturer's serial number on the hull was traced. Confirmed, it was the Sarajevo. Dental records for all 5 missing men were compared against the remains. Every single bone recovered belonged to the same individual. That individual was Scott Moorman. There was no way to determine how Scott had died. There was no way to confirm exactly when. But the physical evidence told a partial story. Scott had somehow reached Sabila Island. His body had been placed in a deliberate grave. A cross had been erected above him. And the bones suggested this had happened not shortly after the 1979 storm, but possibly years later. Scott was eventually returned to his family and given a proper burial. But with him came questions that have never been resolved. The investigation and the clues left behind. In 1990, the families hired a private investigator to pick up where official efforts had stopped. He traveled to Sabila Island with Robert Ralph's twin brother, the man who had owned the Sarajevo, and examined the site personally. He timed his visit to coincide with low tide, allowing him to walk sections of the outer reef that would normally be submerged. That's where he found the Sarajevo's main engine wedged into the reef on the ocean-facing side of the island. Here is why that detail matters. The hull had been found on the lagoon side of the island, the sheltered, protected side. The engine was on the ocean side. These are opposite ends of the same landmass. For the boat to end up on the lagoon side while its engine was lodged in the reef on the ocean side, something or someone had to have moved it. A hull doesn't cross an island on its own. That takes human hands. 4 men still missing. Ralph, Pat, Peter, Benny. No remains. No trace. No answers. Were they lost in the storm before the Sarajevo ever reached Sabila? Did they survive longer than anyone realized? Were any of them still alive when Scott was buried? And the question that sits at the center of everything: who buried Scott Moorman? Someone fashioned a cross from driftwood and pressed it into the sand above his grave. Someone gathered flat coral and arranged it carefully. Around the site, someone tucked a bundle of papers between the stones. Papers that looked as if they had been carried a long way, or preserved deliberately, or perhaps meant as some kind of signal. That is not the work of ocean currents. That is not coincidence. That is a human being choosing to honor the dead in one of the most remote places on Earth. Who were they? Where did they come from? Where did they go? The Sarajevo left Hannah Bay on a quiet Sunday morning in 1979 with 5 men aboard and never came back. One of those men was found buried on an island, 2,300 miles away years after he vanished, and the manner in which he was buried raises questions that the ocean has refused to answer. The other 4 were never found. The families of Hannah carried this for over 4 decades without closure, without explanation, and without peace. Some mysteries end with answers. This one ends with a wooden cross on a sandbar in the middle of the Pacific and silence. If this story stayed with you, share it. And if you have any theories about what happened on that island, I genuinely want to read them in the comments below.